The telegram arrived on the hottest day of August, 1883, and Henry Emmett knew he was in trouble when his foreman collapsed face first into the wheat field, overcome by heat stroke and exhaustion. Los Alamos, New Mexico Territory, wasn't much more than a dusty collection of buildings clustered along a dried creek bed, but the land surrounding it was fertile enough when the rains came. Henry's ranch stretched across 300 acres of rolling grassland and cultivated fields, and this year's wheat harvest promised to be the best he'd seen in his 32 years. But what good was a bounty of grain if there was nobody left standing to bring it in? He'd already lost 2 hands to better-paying jobs up north, and another had run off after a dispute over wages. Now Jackson, his most reliable man, lay in the bunkhouse with the doctor saying he wouldn't be fit for heavy labor for at least 6 weeks. The wheat wouldn't wait that long. Another week of sun would make it perfect for harvesting, but leave it much longer and the kernels would start dropping from the stalks, wasting months of hard work. Henry stood on his porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the wheat fields gold and copper, and felt a helplessness he hadn't experienced since his father died and left him this land 10 years ago. He'd built something here, something that mattered. The house was sturdy timber and stone, 2 stories with real glass windows. The barn could hold 20 horses comfortably. His cattle grazed on the eastern pastures, healthy and fat, but all of it depended on this harvest. He'd invested everything in seed and equipment, gambling on a good year to finally get ahead. The next morning, he rode into Los Alamos and pinned a notice outside the general store. Harvest hands needed. Good pay. Room and board. Apply Emmett Ranch. For 2 days, nobody came. Henry spent the time trying to calculate how much he could manage alone, how many hours of daylight he could work before exhaustion claimed him too. The numbers didn't add up. He'd need at least 3 more people, preferably 4. On the 3rd day, as he was checking the wheat, running the grain heads through his fingers to test their firmness, he heard a horse approaching. Henry straightened, shading his eyes against the morning sun. The rider was slight, dressed in work clothes that had seen better days, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. As the figure drew closer, Henry realized with surprise that it was a woman. She dismounted with practiced ease, her movements efficient and confident. When she removed her hat, auburn hair that had been pinned up came slightly loose, catching the light. Her face was sun-browned and angular, with sharp green eyes that assessed him just as thoroughly as he was assessing her. "I'm here about the harvest work," she said. Her voice was clear and direct, with no hint of apology or uncertainty. Henry blinked. "Madam, I appreciate the interest, but I'm looking for field hands. It's hard labor, long hours in the heat. I read your notice, that's why I'm here." She met his gaze steadily. "My name is Eleanor Cassidy. I've worked harvests before, up in Colorado and Kansas. I can handle a scythe, a pitchfork, and a wagon. I don't complain, I don't quit, and I can work as long as any man you'd hire." Henry studied her more carefully. She was probably in her mid-20s, with work-hardened hands and the kind of lean build that came from physical labor rather than leisure. But still, a woman working harvest was unusual enough to give him pause. "Miss Cassidy, I don't doubt your willingness, but this is rough work. I've had grown men collapse from it. Then they weren't as tough as they thought they were." She crossed her arms. "Mr. Emmett, I've traveled 2 days looking for work. Every ranch between here and Santa Fe has turned me away because I'm a woman. I'm not asking for special treatment. Give me 1 day. If I can't keep up, I'll ride out without complaint and you owe me nothing. If I can do the work, pay me the same as any other hand." There was something in her directness that Henry found himself respecting. He glanced toward the fields where the wheat swayed in the breeze, then back at her determined face. He was in no position to turn away help, even if it came in an unexpected form. "One day," he agreed, "but you have to promise me you'll speak up if it's too much." "I won't have anyone else getting hurt on my watch." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though she didn't quite smile. "Fair enough." Henry showed her to the bunkhouse, feeling awkward about the accommodations. The building was simple and rough, designed for ranch hands who didn't expect luxury. But with Jackson still recovering in the back room and the other beds empty, at least she'd have privacy. "It's not much," he said, standing in the doorway, "but the mattresses are decent and there's a wash basin. Breakfast is at dawn. We'll start cutting when the dew burns off, probably around 7. Eleanor set her saddlebag on one of the bunks and looked around the space without complaint. "I've slept in worse places. This will do fine." That evening, Henry's housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, an older Mexican woman who'd worked for his father, was less accepting of the arrangement. "A young woman staying in the bunkhouse. What will people say?" She shook her head while ladling stew into a bowl. "They'll say I'm trying to save my harvest," Henry replied, though he understood her concern. Los Alamos was small enough that gossip could be damaging. "She's just a worker, same as any other. You are naive if you think people will see it that way." But Mrs. Rodriguez prepared an extra portion of stew anyway. "At least make sure she eats properly. She is too thin." Henry carried the meal out to the bunkhouse himself, knocking before entering. Eleanor had changed into a different shirt, though it was just as worn as the first, and was sitting on the bunk examining her boots. "Mrs. Rodriguez sent this," he said, setting the bowl on the small table. "She's worried you're not eating enough. Tell her thank you." Eleanor stood and moved to the table, and Henry caught the briefest flash of surprise on her face when she saw how much food there was. She covered it quickly, but not before he wondered when she'd last had a proper meal. He hesitated at the door. "Miss Cassidy, you don't have to tell me, but I'm curious. Why are you traveling alone looking for ranch work? It's not exactly common." Eleanor picked up the spoon but didn't eat yet. "My father had a farm in Kansas. When he died 2 years ago, I tried to keep it going, but the bank had other ideas. They took the land and I've been working where I can ever since." She met his eyes. "I'm good at this work, Mr. Emmett. I know the land. I understand crops and animals. I just need people to give me a chance to prove it." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a statement of facts. Henry found himself nodding. "Then I guess tomorrow you'll get that chance. Good night, Miss Cassidy." "Good night." Henry lay awake longer than usual that night, thinking about the woman in his bunkhouse and the wheat waiting to be harvested. He hoped he wasn't making a mistake, but something told him Eleanor Cassidy was exactly what she claimed to be: capable, determined, and worth trusting. The next morning arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Henry was already in the equipment barn when Eleanor appeared, dressed in sturdy canvas pants and a loose cotton shirt, her hair braided and pinned tightly to her head. "Show me what needs doing," she said. Henry handed her a scythe, watching to see how she'd handle it. She took it with familiar confidence, testing the weight and checking the blade's sharpness with her thumb. Without waiting for instruction, she followed him out to the wheat field. "We'll start with the east section," Henry explained. "Cut low and steady. Let the stalks fall to the left. When we have enough down, we'll come back and bundle it." Eleanor nodded and moved to position herself a few yards away from him. When she took her first swing, the motion was smooth and practiced. The scythe cut through the wheat with a clean swoosh, the stalks falling in a neat line. Her second swing was just as good, and her third. They worked in silence for the first hour, establishing a rhythm. The sun climbed higher and the heat intensified. Henry kept glancing over, expecting to see Eleanor flagging, but she maintained her steady pace. Sweat darkened her shirt and shone on her face, but her movements never faltered. By mid-morning, they'd cleared a substantial section. Henry called for a break, bringing water from the pump. Eleanor drank deeply, then poured some over her head and neck without any self-consciousness about her appearance. "You weren't exaggerating," Henry said. "You know what you're doing." "I told you I did." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "Your wheat is good quality. You must have had decent rain this year. Better than usual. That's why I can't afford to lose any of it." Henry took a drink from the dipper. "If you're willing to stay on through the harvest, the job is yours. Same pay as I offered the others, $3 a day plus room and board." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. $3 was generous and they both knew it. That's more than fair. It's what the work is worth. Henry turned back toward the field. "Come on, we have a lot more to cut before the day is done." They fell into a partnership over the following days that felt as natural as breathing. Eleanor proved herself again and again, not just in her ability to keep pace, but in her knowledge and instincts. She noticed when one of the horses was favoring a leg before Henry did, preventing a potential injury. She suggested a more efficient way to organize the bundles that saved them time. She worked with a quiet competence that made her indispensable. Jackson recovered enough to help with the lighter tasks, and together the three of them made real progress. The wheat came in faster than Henry had dared hope. Each evening, they'd return to the house exhausted but satisfied, the barn filling with bundled grain. Mrs. Rodriguez warmed to Eleanor after the first week, especially when Eleanor insisted on helping with the dinner dishes despite having worked all day in the field. "You are a good girl," the older woman said, hands deep in soapy water while Eleanor dried. "But you work too hard. You need to rest also." "I'm used to hard work," Eleanor replied. "Besides, you've been feeding me like a queen. The least I can do is help clean up." Henry overheard the conversation from his seat at the kitchen table where he was reviewing his ledgers. He found himself smiling, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the sound of women's voices in the house, something that had been missing since his mother passed. Or maybe it was something else, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The truth was, he'd started noticing things about Eleanor that had nothing to do with her capabilities as a worker. The way she pushed loose strands of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The rare but genuine smile that transformed her serious face when something pleased her. The grace in her movements even when she was exhausted. He told himself it was just appreciation for a job well done, for finding help when he desperately needed it. But when she laughed at something Mrs. Rodriguez said, a clear, bright sound that rang through the kitchen, Henry felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. 2 weeks into the harvest, a group of men rode up to the ranch just after noon. Henry recognized Tom Bradshaw, who owned the neighboring property, along with 2 of his hands. Bradshaw was in his 50s, wealthy and influential, with political ambitions that everyone in Los Alamos knew about. "Emmett," Bradshaw called out as he dismounted. "Heard you hired yourself some unusual help." Henry set down the bundle he'd been loading and walked over, very aware that Eleanor had paused her work as well. "News travels fast. What can I do for you, Bradshaw?" Just being neighborly. But Bradshaw's eyes had found Eleanor, and his expression was more calculating than friendly. "That's a woman working your field. Her name is Eleanor Cassidy, and she's the best worker I've got." Henry kept his voice even but firm. "I'm sure she is," Bradshaw said with a smirk that Henry didn't like. "But don't you think it's a bit improper? Young woman staying out here with just you and a couple of hands. What I think is that my business is my own." Henry crossed his arms. Miss Cassidy is here to work harvest, same as anyone else I'd hire. There's nothing improper about it." One of Bradshaw's men laughed. "Nothing improper about a pretty girl living in the bunkhouse. Come on, Emmett." Eleanor had approached while they were talking, still carrying her scythe. She stopped a few feet away, and Henry saw that her face was flushed, though whether from heat, exertion, or anger he couldn't tell. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cool and controlled, "I appreciate your concern for my reputation, but I assure you it's unnecessary. Mr. Emmett has been nothing but respectful, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." Bradshaw's smirk widened. "I'm sure you are, miss. Though if you ever find yourself looking for different work, I might have a position for you, something less strenuous than field labor." The implication in his tone was unmistakable. Henry felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate. He stepped forward, putting himself between Eleanor and Bradshaw. "That's enough. You've said your piece. Now get off my land." Bradshaw raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense intended. Just making conversation." He swung back into his saddle. "Harvest looks good this year, Emmett. Hope you managed to bring it all in." He touched his hat brim. "Miss Cassidy." They rode off, leaving dust in their wake. Henry stood rigid, fists clenched, until they disappeared over the rise. When he turned, Eleanor was watching him with an unreadable expression. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I've dealt with worse. Maybe so, but not on my ranch." Henry took a breath, trying to calm down. "I'm sorry about that. Bradshaw's always been a bastard, but that was out of line even for him. Men like him think women are only good for one kind of work." Eleanor's jaw was tight. "I stopped letting it bother me a long time ago." "Well, it bothers me." Henry picked up his tools again. "You're here because you're good at your job. Anyone who can't see that can stay off my property." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "Thank you," she said, and this time there was genuine warmth in her voice. Not everyone would stand up like that. They returned to work, but Henry found his mind wandering back to the confrontation. He'd meant what he said about Eleanor being a good worker, but if he was honest with himself, his anger at Bradshaw's insinuations went beyond professional courtesy. The thought of anyone disrespecting Eleanor, of reducing her to crude implications and assumptions, had ignited something protective in him that felt intensely personal. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez cornered him in the parlor after dinner. "You are falling for her," she said bluntly. No preamble. Henry nearly dropped the book he'd been pretending to read. "What? No, she's an employee. I respect her work, that's all." "Bah." Mrs. Rodriguez waved a dismissive hand. "I have eyes. The way you look at her when she is not watching. The way you got so angry today when those men came. This is not just about respect." "It's not appropriate," Henry said, though even as he spoke the words felt like a weak defense. "She works for me, and she's only here temporarily until harvest is done. So you do have feelings for her." Henry set the book down and rubbed his face. "I don't know what I feel. She's capable and intelligent and strong. Working with her is easy in a way it's never been with anyone else, but that doesn't mean anything. She has her own life, her own plans." "Have you asked her about these plans?" Mrs. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Or are you assuming? I know she's been moving from place to place looking for work. This is just another stop for her. Perhaps it could be more than that, if someone gave her a reason to stay." The older woman moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father, God rest him, he waited too long to speak his heart. He loved your mother for 2 years before he found the courage to tell her. Do not make his mistake." After she left, Henry sat in the silent parlor, thinking. He'd been alone on this ranch for a long time, focused on building and maintaining it. There'd been women in town who'd shown interest, but he'd never felt compelled to pursue anything. The ranch was enough, he told himself. His work was enough. But now Eleanor was here, and suddenly the ranch felt different. The house felt more alive with her presence. Meals were more enjoyable with her quiet observations and occasional dry humor. Even the hard work of harvest felt lighter when she was beside him in the field, moving in tandem with an unspoken understanding that went beyond mere coordination. He was falling for her. Mrs. Rodriguez was right, and he had no idea what to do about it. The next week brought cooler weather and increased urgency. They were in the final push of the harvest, working longer hours to bring in the last of the wheat before any chance of early rain could damage it. Eleanor worked until her hands bled despite the gloves, and Henry had to force her to stop and let him bandage them. "You're going to permanently damage yourself," he said, wrapping strips of clean cloth around her palms in the barn. They'd come in for more water and he'd noticed the blood on her gloves. "They're fine, just blisters." But she didn't pull away as he worked, his fingers gentle on her wrists. "Eleanor." He paused, realizing it was the first time he'd used her first name. "You don't have to prove anything anymore. I know how hard you work, everyone does. It's not about proving anything." She looked down at her bandaged hands. "This is your harvest, your livelihood. I want to see it done right. It's just wheat." "No, it's not." She met his eyes. "It's your dream, your father's legacy. Everything you've built. That matters." They were standing close in the dim barn, dust motes floating in the shafts of light through the walls. Henry was acutely aware of how near she was, of the faint scent of wheat and sun on her skin, of the way her eyes reflected the golden light. "You matter too," he said quietly. "Your health, your hands. I don't want you hurting yourself for my wheat, Henry." His name sounded different in her voice, softer somehow. "I'll be careful, I promise." The moment stretched between them, laden with things unspoken. Henry wanted to tell her what he was feeling, wanted to ask if she felt it too, this pull between them that seemed to grow stronger each day. But before he could find the words, Jackson called from outside, needing help with one of the wagons. The moment broke. Eleanor stepped back, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "We should get back to work." Henry nodded, not trusting his voice. As they returned to the field, he wondered if he'd just missed his chance. 3 days later, the last of the wheat was in. They finished just before sunset, loading the final bundles into the barn. Henry stood looking at the fruits of their labor, the barn packed full of golden grain, and felt a satisfaction deeper than any profit could provide. "We did it," Eleanor said beside him, her voice tired but triumphant. Her face was dirty and streaked with sweat, her clothes covered in chaff, and Henry thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "No," he corrected. "You did it. I couldn't have brought this in without you." Jackson had already headed to the bunkhouse, exhausted. Mrs. Rodriguez had gone home to her family in town. It was just the two of them in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of their shared achievement. "What will you do now?" Henry asked, dreading the answer. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I hadn't thought past getting the harvest in." "You could stay." The words came out before he'd planned them. "I mean, there's always work on a ranch. The cattle need tending, there's maintenance, the winter wheat to plant. I could use someone with your skills. As a hand. As whatever you want to be." Henry turned to face her fully. "Eleanor, these past few weeks, working with you, being around you, it's made me realize how empty this place was before. You're not just a good worker. You're smart and strong, and you see things clearly in a way that challenges me to be better. I don't want you to leave because I don't want to go back to how things were before you arrived." Eleanor's eyes had widened. "Henry, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between you picking up that scythe and now, I fell in love with you." His heart was pounding, but he pressed on. "I know it's fast. I know you might not feel the same way, but you asked me what I was saying, and that's the truth of it. I love you, Eleanor Cassidy, and if there's any chance you might feel something for me too, then I'm asking you to stay. Not as an employee, as someone I'm courting with marriage in mind if you'd ever consider it. The silence that followed felt eternal. Eleanor's face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and something else Henry couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. You love me. Yes. I'm a field hand, a drifter who showed up on your doorstep with nothing but a horse and some worn-out clothes. You're a woman who knows her own mind and isn't afraid of hard work. You're someone who sees a problem and solves it instead of complaining. You're kind to Mrs. Rodriguez and patient with Jackson when he tells the same stories over and over. Henry took a step closer. You're not just a field hand, Eleanor. Not to me. Tears were shining in her eyes now. After my father died, after I lost the farm, I thought that was it for me. That I'd spend the rest of my life moving from place to place, always temporary, never belonging anywhere. No one wanted to take a chance on me because I was a woman. No one looked past that to see what I could actually do. I see you, Henry said. Every bit of you. I know. She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. That's why I fell in love with you too. Henry felt his breath catch. You did? How could I not? Eleanor laughed, a sound caught between joy and tears. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You treated me like an equal. You stood up for me against Bradshaw. And more than that, you listen when I talk. You value my opinions. When you're near me, I feel like I'm finally home after being lost for so long. Henry closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, mindful of her bandaged palms. Then stay. Please be with me, build this life with me. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay. When he kissed her, it felt like sealing a promise. Her lips were warm and soft, and she leaned into him with a sigh that spoke of relief and longing finally fulfilled. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling like fools. Mrs. Rodriguez is going to say she told you so, Eleanor said, laughing. She already has multiple times. Henry kept his arms around her, not ready to let go. I don't care. She was right. They stood there in the barn as darkness fell completely, holding each other, making quiet plans and promises. Eventually, they walked back to the house hand in hand, and Henry felt a completeness he hadn't known he was missing. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. Henry announced their engagement to Mrs. Rodriguez, who did indeed respond with a triumphant declaration of having predicted it all along. Jackson congratulated them both with genuine warmth, saying he'd never seen Henry smile so much. Eleanor moved out of the bunkhouse and into one of the upstairs bedrooms in the main house, a temporary arrangement until they could be properly married. Mrs. Rodriguez acted as chaperone with serious dedication, though she also helped Eleanor settle in and treated her like the daughter she'd never had. The gossip in Los Alamos was inevitable. Some folks were scandalized by the notion of Henry marrying a woman who'd worked as his field hand. Others, particularly the women who'd set their sights on Henry themselves, were bitter about it. But there were also those who saw the genuine love between them and chose to celebrate it. Bradshaw made his disapproval known, stopping Henry in the street one day with a sneer. Marrying the help now, are we? Couldn't find a proper woman. I found exactly the right woman, Henry replied calmly. And what Eleanor and I do is none of your concern. It's everyone's concern when you bring down the standards of the community. What kind of example does this set? The example that hard work and good character matter more than arbitrary social rules. Henry stepped closer. Eleanor is worth 10 of the so-called proper women in this territory. If you or anyone else has a problem with that, you know where my ranch is. Stay off it. He walked away, leaving Bradshaw sputtering. When he told Eleanor about it later, she shook her head but was smiling. "You don't have to fight every battle for me," she said. "I'm not fighting for you, I'm fighting with you." He took her hand. "We're partners now. That means your fights are mine and mine are yours." They were married in late October, 6 weeks after the harvest ended. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in Los Alamos with Mrs. Rodriguez and Jackson as witnesses. Eleanor wore a new dress that Mrs. Rodriguez had helped her buy, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar, the nicest thing she'd owned in years. Henry wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for his father's funeral and had barely worn since. The Reverend, a kind man who'd known Henry's family for decades, spoke about partnership and mutual respect in marriage, about building a life together through cooperation and love. When Henry and Eleanor exchanged their vows, their voices were steady and sure, their eyes locked on each other as if no one else existed. "I promise to honor you as my equal," Henry said, adding his own words to the traditional vows. "To listen to your counsel, to support your dreams, and to love you more with each passing day." Eleanor's eyes shone with tears, but her voice didn't waver. "I promise to stand beside you through all challenges. To work with you to build our future, to trust you with my heart, and to cherish the home we're creating together." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Henry kissed his new bride, the small congregation applauded. It wasn't a large or fancy wedding, but it was full of genuine joy and promise. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food that Mrs. Rodriguez and several of the friendlier townswomen had prepared. There was fiddle music and dancing, and Henry held Eleanor close as they moved to the music, both of them grinning. "Happy," he murmured against her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Henry looked at his wife, at the home they'd share, at the life stretching out before them, and knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Henry carried Eleanor over the threshold of their bedroom. They'd prepared it together over the past weeks, hanging new curtains and bringing in furniture. It was their space now, a symbol of their union. Their lovemaking was tender and exploratory, two people learning each other's bodies and rhythms. Eleanor had been nervous, confessing she'd never been with a man before, and Henry took his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, an expression of everything they'd already built between them. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the darkness, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams for the future. "I want to expand the cattle operation," Henry said, tracing patterns on her shoulder. "Maybe buy the grazing land to the south if it comes available." "We should diversify the crops too," Eleanor suggested. "Wheat is good, but what about corn or sorghum?" "Different crops mature at different times, spread out the labor and the risk." "That's smart thinking." He kissed her forehead. "See, this is what I mean about you making me better. I'd have never thought of that. We think better together," she said, snuggling closer. "That's how it should be." Their first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a happy one. They worked together on the ranch, Eleanor taking on more responsibilities and proving herself just as capable at managing the cattle and planning for the next year's planting as she'd been at bringing in the harvest. Henry consulted her on every major decision, and her insights often led them to better solutions than he'd have found alone. Mrs. Rodriguez continued to cook and manage the house, though Eleanor insisted on helping and learning. The older woman taught her traditional recipes and household management skills that Eleanor's father had never bothered with. In return, Eleanor helped with the heavy work and brought new energy to the household. As winter set in, they settled into a routine of domesticity that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Breakfast together before starting the day's work. Evenings by the fire, Eleanor often reading aloud while Henry worked on repairing tack or tools. Nights in their bed, exploring and deepening their physical connection, learning to communicate pleasure and need. In December, Bradshaw tried to cause trouble again. He filed a complaint with the territorial authorities, claiming that Henry was operating his ranch improperly by allowing a woman to do men's work. The official who came to investigate was a weary-looking man named Foster, who clearly thought the whole thing was nonsense. "Mr. Bradshaw seems to have strong opinions about how you run your operation," Foster said, sitting in Henry's parlor with a cup of coffee. "Mr. Bradshaw needs to mind his own business," Henry replied. "My wife works alongside me because she wants to and because she's good at it. There's no law against that." "Wife," Foster looked up with interest. "The complaint said you had a female employee in inappropriate circumstances." "Eleanor is my wife. We married in October." Henry called Eleanor in from where she'd been doing paperwork in the study. "This is the woman Bradshaw is complaining about." Eleanor shook Foster's hand firmly, her manner professional and confident. "Sir, I'm Eleanor Emmett. I don't know what Mr. Bradshaw told you, but my husband and I run this ranch together. I help with all aspects of the operation." Foster asked a few more questions, clearly just going through the motions. It became obvious quickly that he found no issue with their arrangement. Before he left, he offered some advice. "Bradshaw seems to have it in for you folks. I don't know what his problem is, but I'd watch out. Men like him don't like being told no, and they don't like seeing people succeed in ways they don't approve of." "We'll be careful," Henry promised. "And thank you for being reasonable about this." After Foster left, Eleanor slumped into a chair, some of her composure falling away. "How long is he going to keep this up?" "Until he finds someone else to harass, probably." Henry knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "Hey, don't let him get to you. We're not doing anything wrong. I know. It's just exhausting, constantly having to justify our choices to people who have already decided we're in the wrong. Then we'll stop justifying. We'll just keep living our lives, being happy, making this ranch successful. That's the best response to people like Bradshaw." Eleanor managed a smile. "When did you get so wise?" "Since I married a smart woman who expects me to keep up." The harassment from Bradshaw continued sporadically through the winter, small annoyances rather than serious threats. He spread rumors in town, tried to interfere with their business relationships, even attempted to poach Jackson away with promises of higher wages. Jackson, loyal to his core, told Bradshaw exactly where he could stick his offer. But for every bit of trouble Bradshaw caused, there were also moments of unexpected support. Other ranchers, impressed by Henry and Eleanor's success and their obvious partnership, began seeking Eleanor's advice on their own operations. Women in town, initially scandalized, warmed to Eleanor when they realized she was genuine and kind, not some scandalous figure. By spring, Eleanor had become a respected voice in the ranching community, and Henry couldn't have been prouder. They began the new planting season with expanded acreage and new crops, just as Eleanor had suggested. She rode out with him each morning to check on the cattle, to inspect the emerging seedlings, to make decisions about irrigation and grazing rotation. In May, Eleanor started feeling ill in the mornings. At first, she dismissed it as something she ate, but when it continued for over a week, Mrs. Rodriguez cornered her with knowing eyes. "You are with child," the older woman said matter-of-factly. Eleanor's hand went to her stomach, her eyes wide. "I could be. I hadn't let myself think about it, but my monthly courses are late." "How late?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. Mrs. Rodriguez clapped her hands together. A baby? Oh, this is wonderful news. Have you told Henry? I want to be sure first. What if I'm wrong? But she wasn't wrong. The doctor in Los Alamos confirmed it 2 days later. Eleanor was indeed pregnant, due sometime in late December or early January. When she told Henry that evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down with panic on his face. Did I hurt you? Should I not have done that? Are you all right? Eleanor laughed, her own joy bubbling over. I'm fine. I'm pregnant, not made of glass. We're having a baby. Henry's face showed wonder and awe. A child, our child. Are you happy? Happy, Eleanor, I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and excited and grateful and amazed. He pulled her close. We're starting a family. That night, they lay in bed making plans for the nursery, discussing names, imagining what their child would be like. Would they have Henry's dark hair or Eleanor's auburn? His brown eyes or her green? Would they love the land as much as their parents did? Boy or girl, they're going to know they're loved, Henry said, his hand resting on Eleanor's still flat stomach. And they're going to know that their mother is the strongest, most capable person I've ever met. And their father is the kindest, most respectful man, Eleanor replied. We'll raise them to be good, to work hard, to treat others fairly. The pregnancy progressed through the summer and fall. Eleanor continued working on the ranch longer than Henry was comfortable with, finally agreeing to lighter duties in her 7th month, when even she had to admit that her changing body made some tasks too difficult. She focused on the bookkeeping, on managing the household, on planning for the new baby. The nursery was prepared in a bedroom next to their own. Mrs. Rodriguez knitted blankets and tiny clothes. Jackson, gruff but secretly delighted, carved a beautiful wooden cradle. Friends and neighbors, even those who'd initially been skeptical of their marriage, brought gifts and offered advice. Bradshaw, perhaps realizing his harassment had only strengthened their position in the community, had finally backed off. Henry heard through town gossip that Bradshaw's political ambitions had been damaged by his petty vendetta, making him look small and mean-spirited. There was a certain satisfaction in that. The winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in mid-November. Eleanor grew larger and more uncomfortable, though she tried not to complain. Henry fussed over her constantly, bringing her pillows and tea, reading to her in the evenings, rubbing her swollen feet. I'm going to be the size of a barn by the time this baby comes, she groaned one evening. You're beautiful, Henry insisted. You're growing our child. There's nothing more beautiful than that. Labor began on a cold January morning, 3 weeks into the new year of 1884. Henry sent Jackson racing for the doctor and Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been staying in town with family but had left strict instructions to be summoned the moment anything happened. Then he stayed with Eleanor, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, offering whatever comfort he could as the contractions intensified. The doctor arrived, an efficient older man who delivered half the babies in Los Alamos. Mrs. Rodriguez came right behind him, immediately taking charge of the situation with practiced ease. She shooed Henry out of the bedroom, much to his protest. This is women's work, she said firmly. You wait downstairs. But Eleanor needs me. Eleanor needs to focus on bringing your baby into the world. You will pace and worry and distract her. Go. Henry went, though it felt like abandoning her. He spent the next several hours in torment, listening to the sounds from upstairs, unable to help or comfort or do anything useful. Jackson sat with him, offering the companionship of shared helpless worry. Finally, as the sun was setting, a new sound joined the mix. the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. Henry was on his feet in an instant, his heart in his throat. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed but smiling. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy, and Eleanor is tired but well." Henry took the stairs 2 at a time. In the bedroom, Eleanor lay propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Mrs. Rodriguez's knitted blankets. "Come meet your son," Eleanor said softly. Henry approached slowly, almost reverently. When he looked down at the baby's face, at his son's face, he felt something crack open in his chest. The baby was red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. His eyes were squeezed shut, but even so, Henry could see Eleanor in the shape of his face, could see his own father in the set of his features. "He's perfect," Henry whispered. "You're perfect. God, Eleanor, you're amazing." "We made this," she said, wonder in her voice. "We made a whole person." Henry sat carefully on the edge of the bed, putting his arm around Eleanor while they both gazed at their son. What should we name him? They discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at the tiny life they'd created, Eleanor said, "What about William?" "After your father," Henry's eyes burned with sudden tears. His father, William Emmett, had died when Henry was 22, leaving him this ranch and a legacy of hard work and integrity. To name their son after him felt right. "William Emmett," he said, testing it out. "Well, for short, yes." "I think my father would have loved that." "He would have loved him," Eleanor said, adjusting the baby in her arms. "And he would have loved you as a father." Little will prove to be a loud, demanding presence in the household, but neither Henry nor Eleanor minded. They took turns walking with him at night when he cried, learning to decipher his different sounds and needs. Mrs. Rodriguez taught them both the practical skills of infant care, and Jackson proved surprisingly good at making the baby laugh. As winter gave way to spring, they settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor healed from the birth and gradually returned to helping manage the ranch, though now with a baby to consider in all their planning. They hired another hand to help with the increased workload, a young man named Peter who was respectful and hardworking. Henry found that fatherhood suited him. He loved holding Will, showing him the ranch, telling him stories even though the baby couldn't possibly understand. He loved watching Eleanor nurse their son, the tender intimacy of those moments. He loved the 3 of them together, a family, complete. The ranch prospered that year. The diversified crops Eleanor had suggested proved their worth, providing stable income even when wheat prices fluctuated. The cattle herd grew. They were able to buy additional land and make improvements to the house and outbuildings. More importantly, they were happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way that went beyond mere contentment. They still worked hard, still faced challenges and setbacks, but they faced them together with love and partnership. On their 2nd anniversary, Henry gave Eleanor a gift he'd been working on for months. It was a sign, carved from good oak and painted carefully. It read Emmett Ranch EST. 1873 Henry and Eleanor Emmett, proprietors. "We're equal partners in this," he explained as they hung it over the entrance to the property. "Always have been, from the moment you picked up that scythe. I wanted it officially recognized." Eleanor kissed him, her eyes bright with emotion. "It's perfect. You're perfect." "No," Henry said, wrapping his arms around her while Will babbled happily from the porch where Mrs. Rodriguez was watching him. "We're perfect together. That's what matters." As they stood there looking at their land, their home, the life they'd built, Henry thought back to that desperate day when he'd posted his notice for harvest help. He'd needed workers to save his crop, never imagining he'd find so much more. Eleanor had come into his life when he needed her most, and she'd proven to be the greatest blessing he'd ever received. Not the wheat, not the ranch's success. Her, the woman who'd taken a chance on him just as he'd taken a chance on her. The capable, strong, intelligent woman who'd become the crop he treasured most, the harvest of his heart. They walked back to the house hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next together. The years that followed were full of growth and joy. Will grew into a sturdy toddler, fascinated by everything on the ranch. He followed his father around on chubby legs, trying to help with chores in ways that were more hindrance than assistance, but that Henry treasured anyway. He had Eleanor's green eyes and her serious expression, though he could also be surprisingly mischievous. When Will was 3, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1887, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose Catherine Emmett. Rose had her father's dark hair and a temperament that was sunny from the start, quick to smile and slow to fuss. Henry thought his heart couldn't get any fuller, but somehow Rose expanded it even more. Watching Will gently hold his baby sister, seeing Eleanor nurse their daughter with the same tender care she'd shown their son, he felt blessed beyond measure. The ranch continued to thrive. Eleanor's innovations and careful management had made them one of the most successful operations in the territory. Other ranchers now regularly sought their advice, and Eleanor had earned a reputation as one of the smartest ranch managers around, regardless of gender. The territorial government even appointed her to an agricultural advisory committee, a rare honor for a woman. When some members objected to her inclusion, she'd attended the first meeting, presented a detailed analysis of crop rotation strategies that increased yield by 30%, and silenced all critics. Henry had been bursting with pride. Bradshaw had eventually sold his ranch and moved east, unable to compete with operations like theirs that embraced modern thinking and hard work over old prejudices. They bought some of his land, further expanding their holdings. By the time Will was 10 and Rose was 7, in the summer of 1894, the ranch had grown to over 1,000 acres. They ran 200 head of cattle and cultivated multiple crops. They employed 6 regular hands plus seasonal workers during harvest. The house had been expanded to include more bedrooms and a proper office for Eleanor. But despite the growth and success, the core of everything remained the same. Henry and Eleanor, partners in all things, deeply in love, they still worked side by side whenever they could. They still made all major decisions together. They still lay awake some nights talking about dreams and plans and the future. The passion between them hadn't dimmed but had deepened, becoming something richer and more complex as they navigated the challenges of building a life and raising children together. Will was showing signs of becoming an excellent rancher himself, with his mother's analytical mind and his father's steady dedication. Rose was fearless and curious, always asking questions about how things worked. Both children were being raised to understand that hard work mattered more than gender, that capability and character defined a person's worth. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Henry and Eleanor sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the wheat fields gold, just as Henry had done that desperate evening 12 years ago when he'd needed help and didn't know where to find it. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked, her head resting on his shoulder, taking a chance on a strange woman who showed up claiming she could do the work, not for a single second. Henry kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, even with all the trouble it caused. The gossip, Bradshaw's harassment, all of it, especially because of all that. It showed me what you were made of, what we were made of together." He tipped her chin up to look at him. "Eleanor, you came here looking for work during harvest. You stayed and became my partner, my wife, the mother of my children. You helped me build something better than I ever could have alone. How could I possibly regret that? I love you," she said simply. "I don't say it enough anymore. We get so busy with the ranch and the children and everything else. But I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I loved you so much then I thought my heart would burst. I love you too." Henry pulled her closer. "You're still the crop I treasure most, the harvest of my heart. Nothing else comes close." They sat together as the stars came out, comfortable in the silence of a love that no longer needed constant words. They'd built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch but a true partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection. Their children would grow up seeing what a real marriage looked like, what it meant to face life as equal partners. Will and Rose would learn that love was about choosing each other every day, working through difficulties together, celebrating victories as a team. More years passed. Will eventually took over more of the ranch's day-to-day operations, allowing Henry and Eleanor to step back slightly, though neither ever fully retired. They were ranchers to their core, and the land was as much a part of them as they were of each other. Rose proved to have a talent for business and took over the financial management, modernizing their bookkeeping and finding new markets for their products. She was fierce and smart, and when young men came calling, she made it clear she'd only consider someone who saw her as an equal partner, just as her father saw her mother. As Henry and Eleanor grew older, they spent more time simply enjoying what they'd built. Long rides across their property, Sunday dinners with their grown children and eventually grandchildren, quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun set over the fields. On a warm September evening in 1910, Henry and Eleanor celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. They were in their 50s now, with silver threading through their hair and lines on their faces earned through years of sun and wind and laughter. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they'd been that first day in the wheat field, recognizing something essential in each other that time hadn't changed. 28 years, Eleanor marveled. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you were bandaging my hands in the barn. Best 28 years of my life, Henry said, raising his glass to her. They were drinking wine that Rose had brought back from California, sitting on their porch while 3 grandchildren played in the yard under Will and his wife's watchful eyes. Mine too. Eleanor clinked her glass against his. Though I'm glad we're past the part where I had to prove myself to every skeptical person in the territory. You never had to prove yourself to me. I know. That's why I fell in love with you. They watched their grandchildren play, watched their son and daughter-in-law laugh together, watched the ranch that had been built with their sweat and dreams continue into the next generation. Everything they'd hoped for had come to pass and more besides. No regrets. Henry asked, echoing Eleanor's question from so many years ago. Not a single one, Eleanor replied. This life, this family, you and me together, it's been everything I never knew I needed. As the sun set and the family gathered for dinner, filling the house with noise and warmth and love, Henry looked at Eleanor across the table and thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had started with desperation and a harvest that needed bringing in. It had grown into a love story that had weathered every challenge and emerged stronger. She'd come looking for work, and he'd found so much more than an employee. He'd found his partner, his love, the person who made every success sweeter and every challenge bearable. Together they'd built not just a prosperous ranch but a legacy of respect, hard work, and genuine partnership. The wheat fields that had brought them together still grew golden each summer, still needed harvesting each fall. But Henry knew that the most precious crop he'd ever cultivated was the love he shared with Eleanor, nurtured daily through choice and effort and genuine care. As autumn deepened and they prepared for another harvest, Henry and Eleanor worked side by side as they always had, older but no less committed. Their hands were more weathered now, their movements perhaps a bit slower, but the understanding between them was deeper than ever. One morning in late October, as they stood together watching the crew bring in the wheat, Eleanor slipped her hand into Henry's. "Still glad you put up that notice?" she asked with a smile. "Best sign I ever wrote," Henry replied, squeezing her hand. "Though I was looking for harvest help, and what I found was everything." "We found each other," Eleanor corrected, "and built something beautiful together." They stood there in the morning light, two people who'd taken a chance on each other and been rewarded beyond measure. The ranch would continue to prosper under their children's care. The family they'd created would carry forward their values of hard work, respect, and partnership. But most importantly, the love they'd discovered in a wheat field on a desperate August day would endure. A testament to what could happen when two people saw each other clearly and chose to build a life together based on equality, trust, and genuine affection. Henry looked at Eleanor, at the woman who'd become his whole world, and knew that every morning for the rest of his life, he'd wake up grateful that she'd ridden up to his ranch 12 years ago. She'd been hired to help with the harvest, but she'd become the greatest treasure he'd ever known. His partner in all things, his love, his Eleanor, and that was the truest harvest of all.